I never imagined that I was going to do the things that I have done. I never planned any of them. I never inspired to any of them. I never applied for any of them. And they happened by God's providence. And I just flowed with each time it came on. When one finished secondary school, the time that I did in 1957, there was no way you could decide what you were going to do. And so I did, and then I landed in the School of Agriculture in Ekpere in 1958. Probably that was the only application I've written in all my life to the Western Regional Civil Service, Ministry of Agriculture and Natural Resources. And after 6 months in Ekpere, by some providence again, I was one of 30 students picked to continue the higher diploma in agriculture at this famous School of Agriculture in More Plantation in Ibadan. So I went to Ibadan as a civil servant, spent 3 years training to be an agricultural superintendent, which I enjoyed very much. And then I was posted out in 1961 on completion of the course. A year after USAID came on board, Nigeria was independent a year earlier. The Americans wanted to train future agricultural leaders for this country. And I was again not because I applied for it, but by the special grace of God and providence, I was picked to go to the US to study agriculture. And I was 66. I was in the US studying agricultural science. Now, there was a little bit of personal choice at that level. I was sent to go and train as an agriculturist and study agronomy. And agronomy was the study of soils and plants. But when I got to Michigan State University, I found that there was an option called crop science, which was basically science subsumed into an agricultural production process. And I picked that option because I had studied everything about production agriculture while I was in More Plantation. So that was the beginning into this multifaceted science, which I ended being. And to be quite honest with you, Nemo, if I had wanted a degree in straight science or straight economics, I would have had it because I took enough courses to qualify for any of those degrees. But to be consistent with my scholarship, I had to stay in agriculture. So that was my first exposure to the science of crop production, not just crop production, which was straight agronomy. Then I returned and worked by the time I got back, the Midwest region had been created. And so I was translocated from Ibadan to Benin, to the Midwest Regional Ministry of Agriculture. I stayed there for 6 months. And by some providence again, because I had been contacted while I was in school at Michigan State to become a lecturer at the University of Nigeria, Nsukka. University of Nigeria was midwifed by Michigan State University. I had turned it down because I was on government scholarship, and therefore, little did I know that Michigan State University had contacted Lagos USAID office, and they contacted the Ministry of Agriculture in Benin. And before I knew it, I was translocated again to a project by USAID, the result of which actually created the Federal Ministry of Agriculture and Natural Resources, because that ministry was subsumed in the Ministry of Education earlier. So I spent a year with the research group on the development of agriculture and the institutional framework for agricultural development in Nigeria for 1 year. When I finished, I went back to Benin. But Mr. Bassi, to be true, there was nothing to do in Benin because I was virtually redundant. All I was doing was accompanying the Commissioner for Agriculture, then a gentleman named L.L. Bora, to Federal Executive Council. Gwemudia was the governor. And all I was doing was writing Executive Council memos and sitting down in the Executive Council behind the Honorable Commissioner and passing answers to questions that were relevant to agricultural development. I was visiting a friend in Ibadan, a classmate of mine, my best man when I got married, Professor Ekpere. And I got to know that there was a vacancy in the Faculty of Agriculture. I talked to the registrar. He said, oh yes, if you are interested, we could recruit you. That's how I was recruited to Ibadan. So that was the first part of the whole thing. Now, between then and now, as you will observe, I have done all kinds of things. The most important of which is being appointed Executive Secretary of the Commission. That was where I broke into the Convention of Biological Diversity. I was attending all of these international meetings, both at the WTO, at the World Intellectual Property Organization, and a few others. And I saw all of these interconnecting conventions being proposed at all levels. And most of them were counterproductive in terms that they did not aggregate to something that you could handle as a developing country. And since I was the main advisor to the OAU on scientific and technical matters, I tried to make sense out of what I was getting. And so I put together the OAU African Model Law, which is so cumbersome, people don't understand it, and has become very difficult to manage. That document, which is on the internet, yes. So that's how I got into all of this. Thank you. Let me just stop there.
I was still following. I love the story about how things happened and took a life of their own, and the various places you worked. Very interesting story. And what was the concern of African country at the conversations that you had in the Convention of Biological Diversity that led to Africa developing that model law? I do know that the African Union emerged from the OAU and has now modified that law, and there's a new version that was adopted in 2003. Now, maybe you can take us through what was the concern of Africans and developing countries at the CBD, and then the model laws, and whether we are well served at this time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bassi. What happened at CBD was very interesting in the sense that none of us, I didn't understand what was going on, to be quite honest with you. The Convention of Biological Diversity was a most cumbersome negotiation, but it rose out of concern for world development. The World Summit on Sustainable Development, which was held in Johannesburg, in Pretoria, in South Africa. And so I attended that meeting, and Nigeria was represented by the then President Olusegun Obasanjo, who gave a very brilliant address as to the difficulties of sustainable development worldwide. So out of that meeting came the Convention on Biological Diversity, essentially to address the bastardization of the earth, what was going on about the depletion of the earth resources without necessarily adding any value to it. The whole concept of if we don't take care of this earth, we may not find a place to live by the next century. All of those were packed into this huge document. Now, it is out that when I got back to the OAU, I was faced with the same problem, something that I think I was never going to be involved with. And I was handed a small document at that time by my boss, Dr. Salim Salim, and he said, look, Professor, go and read this and tell me what it's all about. So I read it, and I gave a summary to the Secretary General, which were distributed by the organization, and of course, things took their momentum from there. It is necessary to add that in my capacity as Executive Secretary of the OAU, I wasn't a member of the I was only an observer. I never was able to speak at any of these organizations, even though I knew what was going on or what I wanted to say if I had to say it. But if I had to say anything, I had national representatives, because the CBD had nationals as members of parties and not institutions. But that was how I contributed. And there was a general lack of understanding, to be quite honest with you. It took me a long time to understand what was in those documents. And if you didn't have an institution back home at the national level capable of understanding and reading all of this, then participation at these meetings was null and void. So that's it. As a group, had difficulty understanding some of these issues, but they were blessed because they had a an African negotiating group headed by a gentleman from Ethiopia called Mr. Tiwolde. And Tiwolde was probably one of those who, with whom I interacted most in my almost 10 years at the OAU.
Arising from what you just explained to us, now the African Model Law was produced by the OAU while you were there. Now we have the African version developed by the version created by the African Union. What would you say was the major reason why these model laws were made? And do you think is the model law is fulfilling that, is meeting that purpose for which the OAU conceived of it?
I'm not sure that I have a copy of the modified law. What we did, or what GIZ tried to do, and I was part of that exercise, was to try to disaggregate the OAU model law and remove those components of it that were causing problems because people did not understand what we were trying to do, or what we were trying to do as inscribed in the document was at variance with popular thinking. So they tried to expunge those parts which was making it a little bit unacceptable at the international level, and probably came up with some modifications. That meeting was held in Yaoundé a number of times, and I was there. Now, I happen to be that kind of individual that if what I'm trying to tell you is not going through, I will not waste my time trying to convince you. So I was not going to convince anybody that whatever modifications they made to the law, the OAU model law, was necessary or unnecessary. But I felt convinced that the appropriate time, some of those issues will be unearthed, and probably the spirit of the original document will become obvious. So that was my position on that. There was a lot of threat to the issues raised in this omnibus law, which sort of challenged level. For instance, the issues of TRIPS, the issues of the ownership of the patenting of life forms, the possibility of a biotechnology without a biosafety. There were a lot of issues. The ownership of indigenous people's rights to the crops that were theirs. All of these issues were raised in the original document. And I'm happy to note that out of that document, there is currently a discussion at WIPO on indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge. When I was writing the OAU model, Africa lacks traditional knowledge. The feeling was that the crops and the biodiversity that they have sustained all these years. But it's interesting that all of these issues are being addressed today at the international level, at WIPO, at the WTO rights, the issue of farmers' rights have been unearthed only as a result of the protocol.
Okay, I think the internet is trying to make it a bit difficult for us to have a very smooth conversation, but we are hearing you all the same. So, Prof, the African Union actually, in the preamble to the modified law, said that they gave the impression that the modern agricultural biotechnology would be the key to solving hunger. That was then under the Millennium Development Goal. Now it will be the SDG. So I would like to get your opinion. What do you think? Is this what will solve the issue of hunger in the world and in Africa?
Well, in the world, maybe, in the our world, maybe, but in the African world, I have my misgivings. Let me say why. The more I had gone to from complete objection to biotechnology to accommodating biotechnology, only because I've been able to midwife a biosafety bill for Nigeria. My original position was that you couldn't appropriate rights through biotechnology to the national wealth of nations. Secondly, when we were discussing of these issues at the international level, there was a word, there were two words. The words were precautionary principle. And I can't remember exactly who coined it, but somebody from Brazil may have been the one who coined it. And precautionary principle suggests that if you are not absolutely sure of what the outcome of what you are doing scientifically is going to be, then don't give 100% acceptance to it. So that was one issue that we were able to negotiate in Cartagena. The second issue was the issue of liability and redress. We wanted to hold those who were proponents of biotechnology accountable for anything that went wrong. because we had adequate scientific evidence that biotechnology was harmful to animals, humans, and the environment in many, many ways. But because this was a minority position, it was never completely adhered to. So we negotiated liability and redress. It's unfortunate that some countries do not include this in their biosafety laws, and Nigeria, I think, is one. So if anything happens, you can hold those who developed the technology to ransom. Now, the issue that this was going to be, that biotechnology was the panacea to African food security, was a misnomer, because it was not going to be in the short and medium term. It could eventually provide some respite, but it's not a panacea. So those who were pushing the idea at the time that we were all negotiating this were definitely trying to push something that was not going to happen. Let me say here that it's been, I think, 20 years, between 1999 and today. Nigeria was told by all kinds of specialists that as soon as Nigeria adopted biotechnology and decided to start growing genetically modified plant varieties, all the small farmers will become millionaires. These were people who were given a voice, were saying, yes, it could be, but not yet. Nobody listens. 20 years after that, CHESCO, CHESCO is the biodiversity place in Abuja, somewhere in Guadalajara, was put up. The place has not done a damn thing. It has not done a damn thing, not because we don't have Nigerians who will have worked there, but because of the usual misplaced agenda. Nobody thinks of that process now. There are pockets of biotechnology research going on here and there with the aim of producing compliant, pesticide-resistant varieties, but none of that. If you are a beans eater who has been cajoled into thinking that cowpea is beans, you will find out that even the cowpea that is being released has not done anything, has not given a dent to what we are supposed to do. So it hasn't done a damn thing, as far as I'm concerned. Maybe in the next century, when the country, or now that the country is giving a priority to economic diversification through agriculture, they put their money where their mouth is and allow Nigerian scientists who are doing molecular biology and genetic engineering abroad to come home and start working for them. They might be able to produce 1 or 2 crops that may help them. But in the short and medium term, it is not the solution. I have always felt my very first paper that I ever read when I came back from the US in 1966 was titled "The Small Farmer, the Pillar of Nigerian Agricultural Development." And I stand by that till tomorrow, because it's only the small farmer who can save this country from.
That's a very strong conclusion, and I mean, very strong point. And we really take note of only small scale farmers. So these are the people that should be supported. And the argument that modern biotechnology, once adopted, would turn small scale farmers to millionaires, that same argument is still being peddled today. And we also have the argument that a lot of people saying that, there's something you said, I would like you to speak a bit more about that. We always hear people saying that genetically modified crops don't have any negative impact on the environment or on human health. What do you say to that?
Well, I think people are beginning to learn to the contrary. Let me give you two examples. A couple of years ago, Monsanto came to West Africa convincing all the governments that there is need for them to adopt genetically modified cotton. Some countries did. I think Mali did, Ghana did. Some, maybe Burkina Faso also did, particularly the Sahel countries that were highly involved in cotton production. So they were given the modified seeds. Today, I don't think that that seed is growing anywhere there. Now, what has happened to the ecology? Two things, and it's not only West Africa, it happened also with the production of soybean in Brazil. It happened to the production of cotton in India. And in fact, in India, it was worse because not only were the farmers cajoled to take loans for cotton production, when the crop failed, a lot of them ended up committing suicide. You can get all of this information on the internet. So it's not verifiable. The evidence to the contrary is very obvious, is there. I want to believe that if these countries had followed the natural breeding program for high yielding cotton or high yielding soybean or high yielding any crop, they probably will have ended with a sustainable agricultural ecosystem than they have today. So we know from observation and from scientific evidence that biotechnology or genetically modified seeds are injurious to the environment. As far as living organisms are concerned, there is a lot of evidence. It's just that it's all been suppressed. Much earlier, there was evidence to show that feeding genetically modified feed to mice had a lot of effect on their reproductive system. There is evidence that it leads to cretinism. In other words, cretinism being limited growth probabilities in rats. It has all kinds of negative effects on living human organisms. Those who are the protagonists argue that in those countries where they've been feeding on genetically modified or living modified foods for so long, these effects have not been observed. Now, speculate, because I think science is a discipline of speculation. Let me speculate that the low immunity that is being exhibited in the last 7 months with the advent of coronavirus in some countries, maybe not, may be traceable to the consumption of GMO foods. That is speculation. I'm not saying it's fact, but it's an alternative fact. So you can speculate, you can say anything, you can do anything, but don't tell me that those who've been feeding on GMOs or LMO feeds have not actually ended up with some defective side effects, because we know it is. It may take time, but when that time comes, we'll not be able to identify that it's attributable to, in fact, what you've consumed for over 20 years.
You know, recently in Uganda, the biotechnology law, biosafety law was to be passed, and the president decided to review it and inserted a clause that requires that those who promote or introduce GMOs must be liable if anything happens even in the future. And then there was a big furor across the country that that kind of legislation will stifle science. Does it mean that science should be permitted to use human beings as guinea pigs without any consequence?
Well, maybe that is the same reasoning that informed the expunging of that particular aspect, or the watering down of the words of that particular aspect in the Nigeria Biosafety law. It's exactly the same thinking. I wasn't a member to the final law, which I midwifed, because the law that I midwifed is right here in my study. It's a far cry from the Nigerian Biosafety bill that was eventually passed. And this was as a result of external pressure. It was not because these governments don't, or the scientists in these governments don't understand what liability and redress is. They do. But the lawyers, whose jurisdiction do you apply? Those were arguments of 20 years ago. Let me give you an example of how easy it has been applied in Nigeria. Only last week, in fact, only yesterday, the United States repatriated money or absolved Nigeria of liability for the jurisdiction that was applied in that legal tussle, for which I actually praise the Honorable Minister of Justice, is as a result of the joint adjudication of the Nigerian law and the American law. So when people asked me 20 years ago, how was I going to ensure that liability and redress components of what I was proposing was going to be adjudicated, I really had no answer. I thought the lawyers did have an answer. Of course, I had no lawyers, and I'm not a lawyer. So I insisted that it must be in the document, and it is still there. And I believe that someday, and I'm happy that the president of Uganda made it part and parcel of their law, because you should not start thinking that you can provide a technology that is detrimental to human life and get away with it if, in fact, something goes wrong. So the president of Uganda was right. And let me add that yes, one of the most informed persons when we're putting the model law together, and when we're also arguing about the fact that the Ugandans were dying and the government was refusing to accept food aid of genetically modified feed from the US, were all on my side when all of those issues were being negotiated. And one of the things that happened to me, I must say, was that I was questioned by a very good colleague friend of mine in the UK. Say, Johnson, you are just being unnecessarily fastidious. How can you talk about people who are dying, not eating genetically modified grains? And I said, I believe you, the Ugandans would prefer to die than to eat grains that they know was injurious to their stomachs. And the Ugandans stuck to their guns and didn't accept free grain from abroad. So the president knows. He's well up to date. And I'm glad that there's a president on this continent who is beginning to take its own future into its own hands. Thank you.
Yes, on that point, actually, we are very proud of President Museveni, although we have issues on other fronts, but people have different positions on different views. So that's fine. But there's one other argument that is always being pushed with regard to why we just have to accept modern agriculture, about technology, about post-harvest losses, and the need to take care of pests. Especially the case of cowpea, we're told that without GMOs, farmers are losing so much in post-harvest losses. Now, are there not other ways that farmers can grow their crops and don't have to depend so much on pesticides, and don't have to grow or eat pesticides, because genetically engineered crops that act as pesticides are basically pesticides? What's your opinion on this?
Well, you know, um, as I said earlier, I understand all of these issues because of my basic training. I'm an agricultural scientist. I'm not an agronomist per se. So when I find my colleagues who are specialists touting these ideas, I just laugh. And my only consolation, my only worry is going to study what government wanted me to study at the end of my master's, which was technology transfer rather than technology development. Because if I had done breeding or plant physiology, then at a PhD level, I would tell them the alternative ways. But telling them now as an extension agronomist, they say to you, Prof, yes, we understand what you are saying, but you don't seem to understand the difficulty of going that route. So it is a difficult process. In plant breeding, simple plant breeding, you can breed any characteristic into any crop. So if you are looking for a pesticide resistant crop, and you decide that you are going to breed a strong pericarp into the back of the cowpea, of the seed, so that no insect can penetrate it, you can do it. But it's a difficult process. You have to be a very good geneticist to be able to select and breed into that crop that specific characteristic. And they are cowpea varieties that have tough pericarp that insects cannot bore through. So it's not a matter of not being able to do it. It's a matter of the fact that it's easier and simpler to apply recombinant chemistry, which is the basis of GMO, of biotechnology, to just change one little gene in the configuration of the crop. And so the insect tries to bite it, and either the insect dies or the insect feels something that prevents it from boring or from eating that insect. It's an easier process. It's just you modify the gene, and to modify the gene, you get a gun and you shoot it into the structure. And what you end up after 2 or 3 generations is a resistant plant. So it is easier via biotechnological procedures rather than regular plant breeding procedures. It is not impossible. That's number one. Number two, you can store crops. I don't know, I'm seeing 4 of you. If you lived in the village, you will have remembered how our grandmothers stored their crops. And at the end of the season, when they bring it out, you probably will have less than 5% spoilage. So there are alternatives, storage options to deal with post-harvest losses that our researchers have never thought about, or they have refused to deal with because this is traditional knowledge and therefore discarded for what they are told or what they were taught. It's just that we are looking. And so when we find an easier and a cheaper way, we rather absorb that rather than thinking of a much more difficult approach to solving the problem. There are options. If they look hard, they will find them.
Thank you very much, Prof. Before we open it up for questions from participants, if there are any from Facebook or right here in the chat, I can see one in the chat box. I would just like to ask, what you are an academic, a professor of agricultural science. What is the University of Nigeria doing in terms of training students to come out and really work in this sector, taking care of soils, taking care of seeds, forestation services, of agroecology, and other things besides modern biotechnology?
Well, Nemo, the universities have the capacity to do all of that. Let me defend my colleagues. It is not a matter of the universities not being able to do it. The universities just don't have the facilities to make sure that they can do that. Let me tell you why. I spent 3 years at the School of Agriculture in Moore Plantation. While I was there for those 3 years, I could drive a tractor, I could plow a field, I could milk a cow, I could determine if a chicken had coccidiosis. I could tell you if it had a mastitis. I could tell you the difference whether cocoa had black pod or not. I knew a lot of things. That was why I didn't opt for the agronomy course when I got to Michigan State, because there was nothing new I was going to learn. Today, if you take a graduate of agriculture to the Plateau, to Jos, and you show him a field next to rice, and growing next to guinea corn, and growing next to millet, and tell him to tell you the difference between all of them, he cannot. Why? He has never seen it. He has never. So how do you train an agriculturist? How do you say you are an agricultural officer when the farmer that you are going to be talking to knows more about his crop than yourself, because you've never grown the crop? You've never seen the crop grow. Yes, you have the knowledge, the science of how the crop grows, of how to fertilize it, and all of that, but you've never seen it. So if you want the universities to train agriculturists the way they should be trained, then you must provide the facilities to enable them to do just that. You can never qualify to be a medical doctor unless you see a surgeon was cutting somebody open, and maybe you have actually participated in cutting that person open. You can never be qualified without housemanship. So by the time you became a doctor, you know everything about the human organ and you know how to manipulate the human body. We are training agricultural officers who have intellectual knowledge, they have cognitive knowledge, but they have no psychomotor skills. And you can't expect them to perform miracles. And even at that, when we were employed as agricultural officers, we were given in-service training. We're giving on-the-job training. I wonder if those words resonate with any minister of agriculture. You want them to perform miracles. They can't. If you're an engineer, you cannot register as an engineer with current unless you have the technical competence. If you are an accountant and you want to register as an accountant with ACCA, you cannot register unless you know how to balance account books. And if you want to go out and bring out what they know into the field, then you must provide the universities with new facilities and new equipment for them to produce grounded agricultural officers. That is the problem. It's not that the university do not have the capability of training them. They just don't have the facilities. And government will tell you that they cannot afford it. And yet they are opening up so many universities with faculties of agriculture, all of which come out, they have degrees, but are unemployable.
It's a very, very, I actually hope that we can end this conversation on a positive note. That is really very sad. I just read in the paper this morning, the Minister of Education saying that a bulk of the money paid to universities go to professors. And the ASU president was saying, does it mean that teachers should not be paid? Are they going to teach without being paid? So there are a lot of questions really about investment in education, and without adequate investment for students to get practical experience, as you just said, we are shortchanging ourselves. We'd like to have your final thoughts in this particular session on the intersection between biosafety and biosecurity. There's the issue of new extreme biotechnology, gene drives, and all those things, and some of them may give security concerns. So could you just cap the conversation up by telling us a bit about biosafety, biosecurity, and maybe biodiversity?
Thank you very much. I subscribe to the link, EcoNews, and I'm sure you do too. Yesterday, I read the issue of October 6, and I was surprised at one of the things I read there. There is an article which is titled, "Why Efforts to Capture African Food Systems with GMO Technologies should be resisted." And when you read that article, you will observe that what the science that led to GMO was as a result of gene splicing and the cracking of the gene code many, many years ago. Today, there is a new science. They call it gene editing. And 2 women have just been awarded Nobel Prize for that scientific breakthrough, gene edit. Discussions about vaccines. You will find information that relates to gene editing and the use of chips in the DNA to track this or that or the other thing. If you read about stem cell technology in medical science, you will read about the modifications of DNA and all of that. It's exactly the same thing that is being done to plants. Now, we do not know the outcome. And that is why I talked about the precautionary principle earlier. About 15 years ago, I was a member of a delegate. What I was talking about, the Indian Minister of Science and Technology said, "Prof, where were you 20 years ago when we were shouting against these issues? Now that we have advanced and we're almost at par, you are coming to tell us that we shouldn't participate?" That is the issue. I think it is about time that if we are going to go hook, line, and sinker into gene technology, then we must develop the facilities and capabilities in our own self to be able to deal with the outcomes, negative outcomes, if it ever happens. I do not know as of today that if out of nowhere. The entire cowpea industry that has been, the cowpeas that have been introduced as genetically modified ends up with a virus disease that we have the solution to it. I'm not aware that when we had a problem with tomatoes in the north, a couple of solutions to it. So why do you want to adopt a technology that you cannot control? That is my problem with biotechnology and biosafety. I am happy that we today have a biosafety agency, but again, those who are operating will be able to tell you whether they're well equipped to deal with the bioethics and the whatever outcome of what the agency is supposed to handle. Now, let me give you a little bit of another story. September 11, I don't know how many years ago, September 11, when the tower in the US was bombed, I was in Brazil attending a meeting on genetic engineering of cassava. At a point, I told the gathering that if I was a little younger, I would definitely have taken to studying this fantastic science, biotechnology. Not biotechnology, microbiology, to be able to have, and he said, why? I said, because here people are talking about, what is it called now? What you just said, bio-warfare or whatever, biosecurity. Yes. I said, biosecurity, yes. And I said, right here in Latin America, you have a number of very, very, very poisonous snakes, vipers. So can you imagine taking the venom of one of the vipers and introducing it into one of the main crops that people grow in one part of this continent and ship it to those countries? You don't need guns. You will kill half the population. Their eyes popped that I was thinking like that. But that is the issue. That is the issue. That is the problem. It takes one mad person, mad scientist, to develop a bad science, to create a problem that he did not intend to solve. So there are biowarfare, biosecurity, and bioethics. And you will find that in most of these countries, bioethics has become a major issue. Chinese can create a human being today, but they will not do it because of the bioethics problems. But what if one mad scientist decides that this is the best thing to do, gets a cell, and he bioengineers it, produces a zygote, and before you know it, he hatches a human being from the lab? Those are the issues. So we must be cautious. We must subscribe to precautionary principle. We must subscribe to bioethics, because if you don't, it takes one mad person to produce mad science that creates all kinds of problems. And the COVID-19 is a good example. If you believe in conspiracy theories, it's possible that what we are going through today is as a result of a genetic flight from a lab somewhere in one place, little corner of small town in China. We don't know, but it's speculation. And science is, good scientists must have the capacity to come up with good speculations. If you can't speculate, then you can't hypothesize. And the 0.5% level of significance that you get when you hypothesize 95% of certainty. I'm operating the 5% of uncertainty, which requires precautionary principle.
Wow. Thank you so much. But I was going to let you go at this point, but there's one question you mentioned about just arising from what you said. The issue of biosecurity, the issue of gene editing and the synthetic biology, all these new advancements that are not being regulated. The National Biosafety Management Agency recently had what we saw in the media about less than a week for a committee to produce the guidelines for regulating or monitor or whatever these new technologies. It was a very short period of time that was given from what we read in the media. And usually when we know that when the agency produces this thing, they intend to put it into practice. Do you think that the NBMA may be in a process of bringing in experimentations in this dimension to Nigeria without Nigerians even being aware of the implications?
Nimo, you know, scientists are like prostitutes. If you give them the funds and facilities to do anything, they will do it. And they will go anywhere where the institutional framework enables them to put what they have in the imagination that they have in their head into practice. So if there is somewhere where this kind of experimentation is allowed to take place, and there's a scientist sitting somewhere who wants to actualize his aspirations and satisfy his whims and caprices, he will go there to do it. It depends on whether the regulatory agency in that environment, that scientific research environment, has the capability to regulate it. And what I find, I didn't want to go into this, to this aspect, what I find is that even though we have capable people in the Biosafety, National Biosafety Development Agency, I don't think, I may be wrong, I don't think they're adequately equipped and enabled to carry out their overall regulatory function. We have competent people there, but they must have facilities to get their work done. And I don't think they have them now. I may be wrong.
That's interesting. Well, you're speaking like a scientist. So scientists speak from hypothesis and all that, because the Director General of that institution always says that they have the best equipment and the best manpower in Africa. I personally have my doubts. Because the laboratory itself is a porter cabin with a carpet on the floor with plastic chairs and all kinds of things. But everybody goes and says, this is the best equipment. Is that the best you can have in Africa, Prof?
No, because if you go to a typical life science laboratory somewhere else, we'll find that what we have here is not even a secondary school lab. Let me say this. You're dragging me into a controversy now. The Director General of that agency had been to Tromsø. Tromsø is an institute in Norway, which we tried to put together when I was working. I've been there 3 or 4 times to be part of the training and to be part of training, which we put together to try to help African countries develop capacity in the regulation of biosafety. Now, if you walk into just the molecular lab in Tromsø, you will be surprised at the equipment. Somebody told me not too long ago that one of the best university teaching hospitals in this country does not have an electron microscope. Now, how can you be doing this kind of high-level, high-tech scientific work without having the equipment? Most of the work that you do with recombinant chemistry and genetically modified whatever, you do under contained environments. I don't know whether we have a contained environment laboratory in this country. If we do, somebody should tell me, I will go and visit it. We tried to put one together at Umudike. I don't know whether they had the funds to put it together when they were thinking of cassava modification. So I'm at a loss. I haven't been to their office in almost 10 years. So I don't know what they have. But if they have the best equipment, I know the staff is good. I can tell you that. But if they have the best labs, I'm happy because I'm satisfied because I'm instrumental to establishing the biosafety law, which enabled the establishment of that agency, and for which I remain very, very grateful for those who thought that I had something to offer after retirement in making me the pioneer chairman of the National Biosafety Committee. Let me just close this statement because I'm sure you are going to go, and I feel like saying this. The best satisfaction that I have had working in biosafety and biodiversity and biotechnology is the recognition that I got several years ago from the Nigerian Biotechnology Organization. I was shocked, I was surprised, and yet very happy that my colleagues who are the eminent members of the Nigerian Biotechnology Society requested that I should be honored with a plaque. They were meeting in Mina, and I had to find my way there. That plaque is probably the most important single plaque that I have sitting here in my study. I thought I was an adversary of biotechnology, but the only recognition that I have gotten from being a proponent of biosafety has been from the Nigerian. I want to UBI, and all of them in that organization. I follow what is happening with them. I am glad that at various levels, they are doing well so far. My suggestion is that I hope that the Biosafety Association will come into fruition one day to be able to provide the flip side to biotechnology. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Professor Ekpere, for this wonderful time. This time you've given to us to share this conversation with you on our food safety, biosafety, and biosecurity. Obviously, the short time we've had is not enough to cover all the grounds. You have a long experience. You've been through it all as a civil servant, as an academic, as a diplomat, and you've seen it all. And we are really very privileged to have had you today in this conversation. I hope you will avail us of your time again if you come back for some further conversations in this direction. So thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Ekpere. And thank you to all.
An opportunity.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.